Okay, well, thank you so much for everyone to give me your time. I hope you get quite a bit out of the session today. The session is about Codex HACCP and the revision that's been just published in 2020, just right at the end of it. And so we'll talk about that today. A little bit as a background of myself, I'm CEO at QA Partners and QA Training. So we've got a training organization. And previously I worked as a technical and Marks and Spencer's in the UK as well as working in University of Queensland in Adelaide in a food-related way as well. So for many years, I've worked with Hasseb and have done training on it. We work with a wide range of different businesses in Australia that manufacture food or that are food retailers in all of the different sectors. We offer not just training, but also consulting to our clients. We offer audits and inspections, in particular around troubleshooting in the supply chains. We offer on-site support. We can help you set up food safety culture improvement programs, and we can help you with food labeling reviews as well. We've got a number of different training options. So we do in-house training and public courses right across the spectrum from food safety, things like Hasseb, Hasseb and Hasseb. We do internal food safety auditor training, food labeling, and so on. But we also have an offer on our online training portal where you can do Hasseb refreshers, for example, food labeling courses, and Hasseb and Hasseb courses and more. We also have recently introduced a QA Accelerator Program, which is for early career participants. So they basically, over a 5-month period, can do a set of courses that includes Hasseb and food safety hazards like food microbiology, allergen management, and GMP like foreign body identification and control, as well as doing Hasseb and Hasseb courses, labeling courses, and a investigation course, so looking at customer complaints and root cause analysis. So that gets people that are new in the industry, fairly junior, an opportunity to quickly get started and contribute to the business. Now that's enough about me. What we're really here to do is talk about Codex HACCP. And so Codex HACCP's been around for quite a long time, and you will be doing Codex HACCP because that's what the Food Standards Code requires indirectly, but also what the GFSI schemes require of you. And so with the updates to Codex HACCP, you naturally want to see what the changes are, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the last update to Hasseb was in 2003. So that's quite a long time ago. And you can imagine that the whole food industry has moved on quite significantly from there. It's basically been an annex to the general principles of food hygiene ever since it was set up in 1969. And so there've been a few changes this time around. And one of those is that it's actually a chapter in its own right, rather than just being an annex to that. Looking at the timeline, so this was supposed to be published early last year, but after the November 2019 Codex committee meeting, they decided to adopt a new Codex HACCP revision. And then basically COVID came along and that slowed things quite significantly down. But they managed still to publish it last year, and that is now freely available on the Codex website as well. So what it's called now, it's the General Principles of Food Hygiene document still. It's been revised, so 2020. So that's the most up-to-date version that I'm showing a snapshot of this here. It's still referenced to the original year that it was created, so 1969, but it's really the revised edition 2020 that we need to consider going forward. So what's changing? Well, quite a few things, and a number of things have stayed the same. But I think one of the things that's quite significant in a way, it's that hazard analysis and critical control point systems are now a chapter in their own right. So basically, it's come into its own, and it sits right next to the good hygiene practices chapter. So it's those two chapters that are quite important. And when we look at hazard analysis and critical control point systems, there's a lot more guidance now in the new document. So it's been significantly beefed up compared to the last version from 2003. There's a couple of Principles that were amended, and that's mainly Principle 1 and 6, and we'll go through each one of those to have a look at what the significant changes are within those. Additionally, food safety culture has come in. It's not just the GFSI standards, not just the customer standards that you might be implementing, but Codex HACCP now references food safety culture as well. So that's quite an important change that recognizes that it's not just systems that drive food safety, but it's behaviors of people as well. There's a number of definitions that have changed, and the CCP decision tree has basically been substituted in the sense that there's currently some guidance in the document, but the actual decision tree is going to be republished, so that's going to be available at a later stage. That's not available at this stage, but we'll talk through the principles of what the decision tree will actually cover and how that impacts how you might do your risk assessments. So then let's have a look at some of the general principles. So we've got good hygiene practices sitting right next to HACCP. And if we're looking at the guiding principles, this is all about food safety. And basically, the food safety should be suitably controlled using a science-based preventive approach. And that stays the same for HACCP today, as it always has been for the last 50 years or so. It is very clear from the text that good hygiene practices are the foundation for everything else that we do, including for HACCP. So the good hygiene practices should ensure that the food is produced and handled in an environment that minimizes the presence of contaminants. And that includes allergens and foreign objects and microorganisms and things like that. It is very specific in that the properly applied prerequisite programs are the foundation before you can do an effective HACCP system. And if I'm going to think about where the decision tree is going to go into the future, and we can see that already with some of the other decision trees that have been published over the last few years, the first question that we really need to have is, are we controlling the hazards through a prerequisite program? If that's the case, you're not going to end up with the CCP. So we need to think about what those prerequisite programs are and how well they actually control our hazards. And only if the prerequisite programs can't control those hazards, then we need to start thinking about additional control measures under the HACCP program. The Codex Code of Practice also talks about the role of the food business operator. And I've just highlighted a few words within the text here, but it's basically to develop, implement, and verify processes to make sure that food is safe and suitable for its intended use. And that aligns with the legislation in Australia as well. There's now an increased emphasis not just on people being trained, but actually being competent. And I think it's going to be important that we can actually document when we've trained line operators, supervisors, and so on, how they're actually competent, and we need to assess that in some way. As I've mentioned, the food safety culture is a new element, and so we need to basically now build a positive food safety culture. And that's demonstrated by the management commitment, but also the commitment of all of the employees within the business as well. So it's not just something that somebody can do if the rest of the business ignores that. One other change is initially, because Codex HACCP has basically been set up under Codex, which is an international trading supervision around the world from the various governments. So initially it was set up for internationally traded food. And so now the reference is that this system is also suitable for domestically traded foods as well. The other part that's interesting in HACCP and the GHPs is that it's not just the responsibility of the food business operator. There's responsibility by the governments and the regulators to basically inform consumers as well. And consumers have a role in this to play as well. And so they need to then basically handle food safely, and that's an expectation within the system as well. But as a food business operator, we have to give the consumer sufficient information so that they can actually handle the food safely. And in the past, we've thought a lot about cooking instructions, for example, storage instructions. And now with the update, it also says we have to enable the consumer to be able to identify the presence of food allergens. And so in the last 18 years, I guess we've had much more thought about allergens. And so this is now coming into the good hygiene practices and the Hasseb system as well. So we need to think much more widely about allergens. So if we look at chapter 1, the good hygiene practices, it covers typical prerequisite programs, and that it basically overlaps also with some of the Hasseb elements. So we need to think about that this code of practice has basically been set up to cover not just large commercial enterprises, but also in some developing nations, smaller food manufacturers that don't actually have the scope or scale to basically set up a whole Hasseb program. So this is basically a all size fitting sort of system. And therefore, for some food manufacturers, it's just going to be the GHPs. And if it's just going to be chapter 1 that they implement, they clearly need to think about controlling some processes, for example, cooking temperatures and things like that. So there's a little bit of overlap with Hasseb, so chapter 2 as well. Some of the things that overlap are description of product and processes, consideration whether those prerequisite programs are effective, and that you need monitoring and corrective actions. So some of the key aspects of the GHPs could also be considered CCPs under Hasseb, and the chapter is quite specifically calling out time and temperature controls, as well as specific process steps. Also within the system, so if you're doing chapter 1, good hygiene practices, you need to have microbiological, physical, chemical, and allergen specifications. So we can see every part that we look at in this code of practice, basically allergens are now an important part within that. So then if we look on the right at diagram 2, example of a hazard analysis worksheet, which forms one of the appendices to this code of practice, we can see though that it only lists biological, chemical, and physical hazards. Now we might say, well, why isn't allergen included in that? And historically, it hasn't been as far as most food manufacturers is concerned. I would say most of us would actually now split it out. So we would also have A equals allergen listed here as well. However, if we look at allergen hazards, most of those would be managed through prerequisite programs. And so if we look at what Codex has done, is they actually last year also published a code of practice on food allergen management for food business operators. And so coming back to that theme that if you have a prerequisite program, you don't need specifically CCPs. In that sense, basically you're relying on that code of practice on food allergen management. And that is something that's also been advocated, for example, by the Allergen Bureau, where they advocate that food manufacturers have strong allergen management systems in place as well. And so if we think about that, then it's not all that likely that we're going to have lots of CCPs associated with allergens. We're not generally processing to remove allergens specifically or anything like that. If we're thinking about labeling, which is really a critical step in informing the consumer correctly about the allergens, basically that's coming back to a prerequisite program as well, and that's your labeling management process. And so that's why it's not in here. It doesn't mean we can't keep it as a separate. So you still have your A, B, C, and P. So your allergens, biological, chemical, and physical hazards. But it's just calling out that it's unlikely we will have a lot of CCPs. And in this situation here, you can still consider allergens under chemical in any case. So this is the document that I've mentioned, the Code of Practice on Food Allergen Management for Food Business Operators. And for the first time, that was published last year. So then let's move on to the actual Hasseb chapter. So if we look at the 5 preliminary steps, nothing has changed in that regard. So there's still the same 5 steps. First one is assemble a Hasseb team and identify the scope. Secondly, describe the product. Thirdly, identify intended use and users. Fourthly, we do construct our flow diagram. And then we need to verify that in step 5 through on-site confirmation of the flow diagram. So that stays pretty much the same as it is and doesn't need any further real elaboration at this stage. What has changed, though, is some wording within the Hasseb principles. So if we look at principle 1, it says conduct a hazard analysis and identify control measures. So the words on red are the new wording that have come into that principle and how that's listed in the Code of Practice. Now you would say, okay, there's some new words, but we are doing that in any case. So when you set up your Hasseb program, and you have done for the last how many years, you would have identified control measures anyway. So it's not something that you need to do new at this point, but it just clarifies that that is the expectation. Principle 2, determine the critical control points. And that's where the CCP decision trees come in, and those sort of things hasn't changed in itself. Principle 3, establish validated critical limits. And again, when we have set up critical limits in the past, we would have validated them. We wouldn't have set them unless we believe that they would actually be appropriate. And so that can be out of legislation, it comes out of studies that you might reference, it might come out of some testing that you conduct yourself. But basically, I would hazard a guess that there's no Hasseb program out there where we wouldn't have validated. Principle 4, establish a system to monitor control of CCPs. That hasn't changed either. Principle 5, establish the corrective actions to be taken when monitoring indicates a deviation from a critical limit at a CCP has occurred. So the language has changed a little bit, but basically we would have monitored and we would have had to put something in place if the CCP was not being complied with. So if there was a breach of the critical limit. And so the definitions in the Code of Practice have changed a little bit, and that's why they're now talking about a deviation rather than a breach. Now, Principle 6, that has changed significantly, and I'll go through that in the next few slides as well, but it basically says validate the Hasseb plan and then establish procedures for verification to confirm that the Hasseb system is working as intended. So that's quite a significant deviation. Now, basically, in the past, we would have set up in Principle 6 verification procedures. But now we need to actually prove that in the factory environment, the Hasseb system can actually be implemented and that it's going to be successful. So keep that in the thought in mind as we come through the next few slides, and I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. And then Principle 7 is the same as it was before, establish documentation concerning all procedures and records appropriate to these principles and their applications. So let's go back to Principle 1, because while we had to basically come up with some control mechanisms, there's some guidance around that that's going to make life more difficult for some. And so that is the guidance actually says the hazard analysis should consider not only the intended use, but also any known unintended use. So basically, if you have a product that may be used in other ways than you have intended, you need to think about the food safety hazards and the risks that consumers are exposed to when they're using it in a different way. So the example that the Codex text gives here is a soup mix intended to be mixed with water and cooked. So basically we're relying on a home cooking step to kill certain microorganisms potentially. We also need to then consider if the same thing was going to be used in a flavoring of the dips of chips without heat treatment, what does that mean for the consumer? So basically, in that case, we need to start thinking, is the food that we're selling still safe under those other conditions? And that might mean that you have to change your micro specification of raw materials, that you might have to apply some other sort of treatment. But basically, you need to be aware of those hazards and you need to address those in your HACCP plan. So that's going to be quite complex. A few other examples I could think of, for example, is if you have frozen vegetables and you were relying on people to cook them at home to kill listeria, for example. In that case, you now need to start thinking, well, if people snack on it as a raw commodity, is that going to be a problem? And there are lots of people out there that eat and snack on frozen peas, frozen corn. There's lots of media influencers that basically suggest some of these things for a healthy diet. And so basically you need to now start thinking much more widely than just about how you expect that food to be used. Snacking of pizzas, for example, while you're cooking, there's a whole range of other issues that you might think about. So this could become quite a complex issue, and you really need to think deeply about how you actually approach it. And it doesn't seem from this guidance that a simple note on how to cook the food is going to be sufficient. You might have to say things that actually specifically exclude non-cooked consumption, for example. So that might be another way to think about it. But you have to come up with a way of managing the new requirements in Principle 1. We're looking at Principle 6. The main change there is that we're looking at the validation of the HACCP plan. And basically that has to happen before you actually implement it. So before you start producing the food. So times when you can start validating is either you already have data from a line that's operating and producing other foods, you already have a HACCP plan for other products, and using similar processes, you know that your factory line actually works well, in which case you already have a lot of data. So in most cases where you have existing HACCP plans, I would say you don't have to revalidate because you have a lot of data, you've verified it, and you know that the system works. However, if you're setting up new products, new HACCP plans, in that case, you would need to have some evidence of why, for example, a new production line would actually be performing to your expectations. And when we're looking at validation of the HACCP plan, it goes right across all of the elements of the HACCP system. So identifying your hazards, looking at your critical control points, the critical limits, they've been already validated as you're setting up your HACCP plan, but control measures, frequency and type of monitoring, corrective actions, and the verification activity, all of that needs to be validated before you start producing. So clearly, when you have factory trials, some of those situations could also be used as far as validation is concerned. Also, as far as the validation is concerned, the Codex text basically talks about validation of control measures already happening at step 3, so Principle 3, I should say. So that's already happened, but beyond that, during the initial implementation of the HACCP system, we need to basically verify that the procedures will work. We need to have evidence that in operation, the equipment actually delivers the outcomes that you have actually targeted as part of your HACCP. So you then need to be able to demonstrate that you're going to have consistent compliance with your HACCP plan in actual production conditions. And so there are a number of different ways in which you can look at it. For example, statistical process control can give you some idea of how reliable and consistently your equipment actually works. Now, you can't use statistical process control to assure that a CCP is compliant, but it gives you a measure of how variable your processes are. So that's one way in which you can look at that, for example. And so if you have some new equipment, for example, an oven, some of the validation might be actually going through and determining hot spots and cold spots and how you're actually going to achieve consistent operation. Often when you start up a processing line at first, it will take a little bit before processes settle down into a constant state. So you need to then validate how long that takes and whether you're going to be producing safe product in the meantime. So all those sort of factory related data needs to come into that validation. And then any changes having potential impact on food safety then require you to have a review of your Hasseb system, and you might have to revalidate that. And that's no different to the current requirements of a minimum annual review and to review your Hasseb system if anything changes. So as I mentioned, the Hasseb decision tree that Codex has published previously is no longer out there. There's some guidance in the document, but eventually this year they're going to publish a new decision tree, and so that's imminent as well. They just need to first agree on how it will actually look like. So there's still some guidance in there that's consistent with the current decision tree or the previous decision tree. So first of all, if a control measure cannot be used at a step, then that step is not a CCP for significant hazards. So that's one exclusion criteria. If a control measure can be used at a later step, or there's another control measure for the hazard at another step, the step is not a CCP. And so that's always been operating as the fourth question of the Codex HACCP decision tree, and so basically that hasn't changed either. But basically that gives us a way to rely on the last step in the process where we can exercise control over a specific hazard, and so we have one CCP associated with that rather than have a wide number of different critical control points that we then can't monitor appropriately, and therefore we lose control. Where a control measure at the step is used in combination with the control measure at another step, both steps are CCPs. So clearly that's quite logical as well, but that's something that they are calling out now, and that gives us maybe some of the idea of where the decision tree will go from here. All right, food safety culture. So as I've mentioned, that's something that we're now covering in all the GFSI standards, customer standards, and it's now also in the Codex text as well. And that comes back to recognizing that human behavior has a major impact on providing safe and suitable food. Now, within the Codex text, there's actually some examples of what the expectations are. So basically, to establish and maintain a positive food safety culture, you need to have commitment from senior management, but also all the rest of the personnel as well. It's no point if the manager is willing, but the staff just ignore it. And, you know, we've had management commitment part of GFSI standards for a long time now, but really it has to flow through the whole of the business as well. Leadership needs to set the right direction and engage all personnel. And one critical aspect, and that's logical as well, it shouldn't have to be said, but they're calling it out, is basically that you need to have everybody in the business aware of the importance of food hygiene. You need to have open and clear communication, including for deviations and what the expectations are. I think one of the issues with food safety culture when that's not managed well is that people might be too afraid to actually stop the line to call out issues, and therefore deviations just go unreported. And that's often in situations where there's excessive pressure to get product out the door without a counterbalance of whether the product is right or not. And so it's quite important that staff know what to do when those deviations happen and what the expectations of the business are. And I think the other thing with food safety culture, you need to have sufficient resources to actually implement the food safety system. If that's not provided, then you're going to fail. Now, it's always a difficult conversation, what is sufficient and what is too expensive and those sort of things. But at the end of the day, if you have a well-functioning quality and food safety system and a team that works with the rest of the business, you're going to save money from better quality outcomes, less waste, and those sort of things as well. But often that needs to be quantified for the business to understand. And so we've got a few white papers on our website. If you're interested in reading some more about the food safety culture, we can certainly have a conversation regarding that as well. The Codex text is also much more focused on training. As I've mentioned previously, it really comes down to competence, not just to have staff that have been told once or twice what to do, even when you have regular toolbox meetings, those sort of things. If you don't know whether people are capable of actually implementing what they've been told, that gets quite difficult. And so you need to actually see people doing their job and seeing whether they're doing that correctly. And that's what auditors would do in many cases. So some of the training that are called out in the Codex document now are that staff have to understand the nature of hazards associated with the food. So that's the allergens, biological, chemical, and physical hazards. They need to understand the processes that you undergo within that business and how food has to be stored. One of the new elements here is that they have to be competent in the use and maintenance of instruments and equipment associated with food. So they need to know how to operate that properly. If it's not operating properly, what needs to be done to fix it? And if they can't do it, who needs to do that on their behalf? But all the instruments and equipment is also measuring equipment that has to be calibrated and kept functioning. So that's now covered under the training clauses here as well. The principles of food hygiene and personal hygiene have to be taught to all participants within the business, and they need to know what the appropriate actions are when food hygiene problems are actually observed. So what are the corrective actions? But even if they don't know specifics, at least they need to know who to talk to, so their supervisor, for example, and actually elevate issues that might occur. So quite important to get people involved from a culture, but also making sure that they're sufficiently trained so they can do their job. There's also a few definitions that have changed. So for example, disposing and disposal is now just called disposition, replacing loss of control with deviation. So you'll see deviation occur quite a lot in the text. So that's what the official terminology is now. Validation as a definition in general has been removed, but they're keeping validation of control measures in. And they've basically added a food business operator, an FBO. That's an entity responsible for operating a business at any step of the supply chain. So in line with legislation where basically the FBO would be primarily responsible and have final responsibility for what happens in the business. And so the CEO, the most senior person in the business, not only has to implement food safety systems so that the systems are operating effectively, they need to keep themselves informed of whether it's functioning or not, because if it's not, they're still responsible for that. Validation of control measures, so coming back to that definition, is obtaining evidence that a control measure or combination of control measures, if properly implemented, is capable of controlling the hazard to a specified outcome. And so that comes back to some of the thoughts around food safety outcomes with Hasseb, where you're targeting, in some cases, not the elimination of a hazard because you have no specific control measure that can achieve it, but you want to have a significant reduction of the control measure. So that's, for example, in industries where you rely on sanitizers, where you have a limited reduction of microbial levels, for example, but that's the best that you can do. In that case, you then think about your raw materials, but basically the specified outcome is then, for example, a 2 or 3 log reduction of specified microorganisms. You're not going to be able to kill them altogether. And so you need to think about what the outcome is and how much you can actually achieve. Verification is the application of methods, procedures, tests, and other evaluations, in addition to monitoring, to determine whether a control measure is or has been operating as intended. And so that might be looking at documentation and see whether that's been completed properly, but it's also looking at whether your calibration's been done, whether the measures that you've taken at critical control points were all within control, or whether you had deviations. All of those sort of things need to be looked at. And so the way I always look at validation is you look at the future. So is it going to work? Verification, you look to the past and you're basically saying, has it worked? So both of those definitions are also within the Codex text. So then a few final points to all of the changes. One of the things that hasn't been addressed by Codex is intentional contamination or food fraud. So food fraud and food defense issues have not been dealt with in Codex HACCP or in the GHP specifically, and it doesn't actually mention either of those. I also had a look whether there are any other texts in relation to that have been published by Codex, but not at this stage. So really what you have here is something that we've always done in the past when we're looking at food safety programs, we're looking at HACCP and prerequisite programs. That's all about unintentional contamination. So even if you're doing Codex HACCP successfully, there's a whole world of other issues out there. And so you need to then think about your TACCP and VASCP systems and how they sit alongside and how they possibly integrate with HACCP. And if you're looking at food fraud and food defense, clearly there can be a high number of different items that can be used that are actually hazardous to the consumer. So for example, we had cumin that had peanut shell incorporated in a food fraud attack a few years back. And you can clearly imagine how those allergenic adulterants basically can have a food safety impact as well. As I mentioned, what this Codex text seeks to do is cover everything from a very small business to very large international businesses. And so basically, if you're just going to do the GHPs, that's not going to be appropriate in the food business that you're operating in. So you need to read basically chapter 1 and chapter 2 together. I would also recommend that you start looking at your validation. So when you're starting to set up your next HACCP plan, you have basically new programs, factory lines, new products. You need to start thinking how you actually then validate your HACCP plan. So that's something that the auditors will start looking for sooner rather than later. And so it's important that you start documenting that and have that information available. And in some cases, that might be the case because you've already been operating for 20 years on a set factory line and you've got all the data that you need. But basically, it's something for new activities that you need to address. All right, so that's basically my presentation, and I just want to give it over to you and see whether you have any questions associated.
Thanks so much, Andreas. That was a great overview, and I think everyone will have got a lot out of that. So does anyone have any questions for Andreas? Well, while we've got him here, his undivided attention.
Yep.
There's none in the chat box, but I might ask one to get things moving. So I was wondering, there's probably no set timelines for this, is there? Is it what should businesses sort of set themselves up for, I guess?
Yeah, so I guess the problem with the whole Codex Commission is they don't operate like the GFSI standards or retailer standards. They basically published it. They didn't tell anybody about it. It just sits on their website. They don't even publish what the specific differences are. That's something you have to figure out yourself. And I guess that was one of the reasons I gave this presentation today, to make sure basically that you don't have to go digging too far, but that you have some idea what to go looking for. So with that, basically, you need to now start thinking what Codex HACCP you're actually implementing. And if you're looking at your HACCP plan, you have to reference a reference document, which in the past has been that annex to the Codex text, and that basically would have been the HACCP that you follow. Now, with this revision, the old one is no longer valid. So you need to update your HACCP plan with the new reference document, which is basically revision 2020, in which case, if that's what you're referencing, you also will have to update your HACCP plan. So it all sort of sits together now, because if the auditor comes through and says to you, basically the text from 2003 is no longer valid, then you've got a problem defending your HACCP plan. So while there's no set timelines, it's really trying to mitigate your risks, basically start early, work your way slowly through it to make sure that there's nothing that's significantly changed. And really the two key things here is to remember that you need to think about unintended use. And if you're setting up a new HACCP plan, you need to basically validate that. And both of those, I think you're better off to start sooner and think about that and develop actions around that rather than not. And some of the other things that are new, like, for example, the whole thing about food safety culture, I would say you're addressing that in any case because you're already on the march with the GFSI standards.
Great, thanks, Andreas. Although I know that probably some smaller companies will not, will choose to implement HACCP and not GFSI. So
yeah, understand.
Oh, yeah. So a couple of questions here. Someone wants to know they'll get a copy of the presentation. Sorry, I didn't ask that, but are you happy to share your presentation?
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
All right. So someone's just asked the implementation time expectation for ANZ. Well, I think you've probably just spoken to that. Comment from Dion. He said, not every business in the food and beverage industry has a qualified HACCP expert in their ranks to develop and now revise their HACCP plans, and they see it as a huge impost and a major cost. Do you have advice for SMEs on how to address this?
Well, if you already have a HACCP plan, in which case it's a revision, for some of the SMEs, they may be addressing this differently, because if they're just covered by the Food Standards Code, so registered with the local council, and they're not exposed to major retailers and therefore GFSI schemes, they don't need to do specifically HACCP, but they still need to have a plan that addresses all of the legal requirements. And that legal requirement under the Food Standards Code doesn't say that you have to do Codex HACCP. You just have to address the principles, and the Food Standards Code hasn't been changed. So for a lot of the SMEs, a lot of the SMEs, that won't specifically change, but if you are on a GFSI standard that says you have to do HACCP, then you need to start updating things.
Great, thanks, Andreas. Good advice. I do think, to Dion's point, there are a lot of SMEs out there who struggle with the requirements. So, but at the same time, they need to have food safety plans in place to protect consumers. So
yeah.
Okay, so there's just a question about your pictures that you've got up on the screen there. Someone's noticed that. Where's the question gone? That HACCP for harps has less units than HACCP refresher nationally recognised. Why is that?
Okay, the reason for that is that basically if you're looking at the horticulture industry, the risks are totally different. If you're looking at food manufacturing, you often have controls like temperature, pH, water activity controls, and you don't have that in the fresh produce industry. And so if you want to produce and pack safe produce, it all comes back to the inputs. So it's water, fertilizers, all those sort of things, and they have to be tightly managed if you want to have good food safety outcomes. And so basically the two courses are quite different in the structure because they approach food safety according to the needs of the industry that we're talking about, and that's why the lesson number is different.
Thanks, Andreas. So a question here saying, regarding the unintended use, what if there are practices that we as a manufacturer are not aware of? Excellent question.
Yeah, and again, look, if you're producing a product, you probably have a pretty good idea of what people do with it. It comes down to what would you do in your own kitchen. So if you're manufacturing, coming back to say a French onion dip, and you know that you use it for other things as well, chances are other people will do it. So it's having a general understanding. Now, if there's a totally new trend, it's difficult to anticipate all of those things. But I would imagine that if you're across what you do with your products, other people within the business, but also have a look at what some of the trends are. You know, you've got a lot of social media influencers, celebrity chefs, all that sort of stuff. You will start seeing what some of the trends are and what people are doing with the product that you're actually manufacturing. And so that's probably the best advice I can give you. There'll be always something new, but I think for most of the things, we would have a fairly good idea what the sort of risks are. If in doubt and you're not quite sure and you're basically manufacturing for a retailer, for example, there's nothing stopping you having a discussion with them and actually understanding what their thoughts might be in case you're not totally sure yourself. But clearly, once you start that conversation, you also have to take on board the feedback that you get.
Yeah, I think another opportunity would be to look at things like your customer feedback.
Yeah.
You know, monitoring if you've got Facebook or social media,
Yeah.
to add to what you just said, because you can see then what people are doing with your product. But I think the other thing, Andreas, would probably be if you can demonstrate that you've looked at all the potential uses of your product and somebody does something really weird, then you're not going to necessarily be held accountable. It's just you can demonstrate that you've had a robust process.
Yeah, and that's why you document that review and why you included something. Absolutely.
Yeah. Question here. So how do you think Hasseb auditors will verify the competence of trained staff?
Okay, good question. I can only say from what I would do. I don't know whether every auditor would do the same thing. But for example, if you had a metal detector, you would just walk up and say, well, can you actually show me what you do? And you watch it, and either it is what should be happen or it's not. And so it's fairly easy to assess from that point of view. If you're looking at CCPs and they're constantly drifting and you're not quite sure and people not signing, that gives you some idea that they're not really competent either. But basically after training, how you know somebody's competent is they show to you that they understood what they need to do and actually show you on the factory line rather than just hypothetically.
Great, thanks. Are the new changes going to be enforced by state governments, for example, Prime Safe?
Coming back to the Food Standards Code, the Food Standards Code does not require that you do specifically the Codex HACCP version. It references the principles, but not the new principles per se, unless the Food Standards Code is going to be updated in the future. So currently, as far as the regulators are concerned, if you are compliant with the Food Standards Code and any additional requirements like Dairy Food Safety Victoria, for example, then that's fine. It's when you get into, you have to do Codex HACCP because you do a GFSI scheme, that's when you really need to focus on updating and keeping up to date with Codex HACCP.
Yeah.
Also, if you actually reference Codex HACCP, clearly you need to reference the current one. And so if that's how you address the Food Standards Code requirements, then clearly you need to update as well.
Great. Someone's just asked, where can I get the new version?
Okay. Oh. If you Google Codex HACCP, basically a code of practice, then that comes up on Google and you can quite easily download it. So that's just a very quick search.
Yeah, I think we can probably send a link out when
yep.
I
we
send out the recording.
actually send the standard out if you like, so you have that.
Yeah. All right. So another question, probably similar to the previous one. So how do you see auditors assessing food safety culture?
Okay, that's probably a tricky one, because when we talk about food safety culture, we're talking about underlying things. We're not talking about the systems and how paperwork is being kept, but we're looking at what people believe. This is what we always do. This is what we should never do. And it's those sort of things that are harder to sort of quantify. If I was auditing and looking for food safety culture elements, a lot of times just simply walking onto a site and see how tidy or how messy it is gives you some idea of whether people are actually thinking much about it. And then when you start talking to people, it becomes much more obvious whether they're actually keen to implement things as they should be, or whether they're happy to take shortcuts. often it's just standing in a production area and just watching what people do. It's not necessarily, as I say, something that's hard and fast written rules, but it's basically observations, looking at how people are trained, what the incentives are, to, you know, if you have, for example, a monthly call out of the best operator that has improved food safety, if you start seeing people saying not just time lost due to injury, but starting measuring things like how many customer complaints have they had, how many near misses, so where basically they had to stop the line because they might have had a withdrawal or recall if they hadn't. If they start measuring things like that and sharing that within the business, that gives you some sort of idea whether the food safety culture is heading in the right direction or not.
And I think to your point earlier, Andreas, it's also how far up the, you know, kind of tree does it go in the business. So it's not just talking to the people in the factory, but, you know, senior management as well.
Well, if you talk to the quality manager and all they moan is how nobody listens to them and how production doesn't care what they say, that gives you a pretty good indication as well.
Yeah. So someone's just made a comment. I'd like to add that for food safety culture, communication is also a point to visualize the implementation. Absolutely.
Yep.
Question for you, Andreas. Do you think the GFSI standard like BRC already complies with the new changes for HACCP Codex?
I think GFSI doesn't consider unintended use. I know from a retailer perspective, they're keen to address some of those concerns and have for some time. So from that point of view, I don't think it's totally aligned. And also it doesn't ask necessarily for validation of the HACCP plan. They do, and while they're not very explicit, do require though that you track how consistent your operations are. And so SQF for a little while called out statistical process control. They dropped it because they think that just sounds a bit too threatening to a lot of people. But within the GFSI standards, you do have to measure how consistent you are in production to meet quality expectation. You need to basically also look at whether your CCPs are under control. So you have to do a lot of the elements from a day-to-day operational point of view. That's in the new Codex HACCP 2020 revision. Basically, it's asking you to do upfront. In the GFSI systems, you basically would be doing that on an ongoing basis. And so I guess the step of doing that before you go into production is also a difference that I would see.